Welcome to the revision PowerPoint for the poem Checking Out My History for your Power and Conflict Poetry exam. First thing that I'd like you to do when revising this poem is listen to the recording of John Agard reading out the poem.
Checking out me history. Them tell me what them want to tell me. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to me own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and E-Cat, but Toussaint Louverture, you know, them never tell me about that. Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick back, Napoleon, battalion, and first black republic born. Toussaint, the thorn to the French. Toussaint, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me about the dish, run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the maroon. Nanny, seafar, woman of mountain, dream, fire woman, struggle, hopeful, stream to freedom, river. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shagga the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and she lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary C. Cole. From Jamaica, she traveled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go even when the British said no. She braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise among the dying. Them tell me what them want for tell me, but now I checking out me history. I carving out my identity.
So now you've listened to the poem, and I'd encourage you to listen to it many times during this revision process that you're going through. It's important to consider the way that John Agard performs and delivers this poem. When you're looking at the written poem in front of you as well, have a look at how the structure moves and the pace and the rhythm of the poem flows, particularly in the parts where he changes his intonation. He speeds up the pace and almost goes into a song-like rhythm. That's really important to show the contrast between the different historical figures in the poem, and of course to show the conflict in the poetry between what he has been hidden from in his own history, in his own heritage, and what he has been taught. So if we think about poetry overall then for this Power and Conflict anthology, you have been preparing each poem thinking about the big ideas. And this is the structure that I want you to use and analyse all of your anthology poetry. So learn this structure and try and apply it to every poem. So these key questions ask yourself. What's the idea and tone of the voice that's been established at the beginning of the poem? Does that link and should that link to the writer's big ideas? It should do. Have a point about the writer's big idea in the first paragraph, the introductory paragraph that you make. And at every point in every paragraph, consider how that idea is conveyed. Move on to your next paragraph. Again, consider the writer's big ideas. Think about the methods, the what, the how, and the why. So you're thinking about language, structure, and form, and all of the contextual references as well, which are really rich in this poem. Then, as you can see the arrow here on the PowerPoint slide, what connections can you make between the beginning and the end? So how is that idea, the tone and voice coming through? What's happening at the start? What's happening at the end? And most certainly in Checking Out My History, it's got a very rich structure to discuss. Look at how the stanzas move, how they are broken free from the kind of restraints of syntax, grammar, and that structural control Agard doesn't use any of those, so lots of enjambment, lots of movement within this poem, and later on we'll think about the reasons why he breaks free of those grammatical restraints and why actually he uses kind of phonetics instead. So have a look at the image on the screen here. Take a moment just to think about and explore the big ideas that might be coming through in this poem. How does this image make you feel? And what might it symbolise now you've listened to the poem? How could this image link to the title of the poem? And again, it's really important with poetry to think about your interpretation. I'm going to give you and show you lots of points to revise today, but also within our discussion, it's really important in poetry to think about your interpretation. Different levels of inference and interpretation, critical thinking can allow you to access the higher points in the marking criteria. So contextual information then, here's a bit of revision for you on the slide and on the screen. So John Agard was born in British Guyana, a Caribbean country in South America. He was born in 1949. He moved to the UK in the 70s and is well known for powerful and fun performances of his work. Most certainly you can have a look at him on YouTube. You've just heard him perform this poem, and take a while to have a look over and perhaps research and watch him perform this poem. He moved to Britain in 1977 and he sees culture as both as an insider living in Guyana and also as an outsider moving to Britain and being different. He's regarded as a performance poet due to the nature in the way he writes and delivers his poems. And he said that using humour breaks down boundaries and breaks down that initial conflict because it engages people, it entertains them, and it ultimately enlightens them. So his poetry often examines cultures and identities. So since the early 17th century, the country of Guyana in the Caribbean has been mostly colonised and controlled by the Dutch, French, and most significantly, particularly for this poem, the British. The indigenous population spoke Arawak, but the British introduced English as a language of the government, the courts, and the educational system. So if we link this to the message and the big ideas that are coming through in Checking Out My History, have a think about that dominance of the British language. So for centuries, nations have repressed the culture and identity of civilizations they've sought to colonize as a means to control the population and eradicate any opposition to the foreign presence. So if we link that to power and conflict, think about the influence of power here that British are having over people's identities and people's cultures, and what Agard is writing about in this poem. So, really importantly then, he uses non-standard phonetic spelling. So it's written as the word sounds, and that helps to represent his own accent. He writes about what it's like being black, to challenge racist attitudes, especially to those who are unthinking. So he uses techniques from oral poetry, repetition, strong rhythms, chanting and phonetic spellings. We see this in the lines here that I've highlighted, dem tell me, and then here it ensures that the poem links to the oral tradition of communicating history. So the Caribbean phonetic spellings creates a sense of pride for Agard in his own background. When we move to the use of standard English, particularly in the lines 46 to 49, it identifies that figures from his Caribbean heritage should feature in the teaching of history. And actually, he wasn't taught about these figures. So the importance he's placing here on some of these figures shows what he wants to be shown in his own history, in his own culture. So again, there's another quotation there for you to highlight and to have a look at. So let's have a think about what this poem is about. Is it about anger, admiration, celebration? At the end of this PowerPoint, I've linked for you to watch John Agard actually talking you through the intentions of his poetry, him reading his poetry and talking about what he was wanting to get across to his audience, to his listeners, to his readers. And it isn't just about anger. It's also about celebrating the key figures of his own history and of his own heritage. So it would be really narrow-minded for us to just think about this as an angry poem, about him in this metaphorical language being blinded and bandaged to his own history. There's much more to it than that. So what's happening then? So the narrator is talking about his identity and how it links to the knowledge of his history. Although born in Guyana, he was taught about British history and not about his own Caribbean roots. And throughout the poem, he praises important figures from diverse backgrounds who he believes should be celebrated. He says that he's going to create his own identity based on his heritage. And as you listen and you watch later on John Agard deliver this poem, listen to the emphasis in the rhythm and the pace and the movement of the stanzas in this poem, and where the emphasis is placed on the figures from his own heritage, how he skips over and the pace quickens when we get to the figures from British culture, almost like that nursery rhyme feeling. So the structure of this poem, think about language, form and structure in AO2, is a dramatic monologue. And remember, you will never talk about a poem in isolation. You will always talk about it in a pair, comparing it across to another poem. So just remind yourself, what is a dramatic monologue? A dramatic monologue is a piece of verse that gives the speaker a voice to express his or her feelings to a silent audience. So think about other poems in your cluster in the Power and Conflict anthology that are also dramatic monologues. Do they have any links across, any points of comparison in their language, in their structure and in their form that you could potentially link together in preparation for this exam? Now, there are things that you need to know about to understand fully this poem. And on the screen here, I've labelled each figure and each reference for you to read through. So 1066, Dick Whittington, Toussaint Louverture, Nanny de Maroon, and all the other key figures that come up in the poem. Take some time in your annotation to read over them, to understand their significance and their importance. And most importantly, to understand which figures are British and which figures align with what Agard wants to know in his own culture and his own identity. A few more here on this screen takes you through some of the key figures from Agard's own history and the importance of them. Look at their importance in history and why Agard feels like he should have been taught about this to show his own identity, not the British identity. So, linking back to our first slide, the big ideas that come through in this poem. Number 1, the power of humans. 2, the effects of conflict. And 3, the abuse of power. Now, as we work through the poem now on the next couple of slides, you could colour code your anthology and set apart 3 colours. Colour code your annotation to show these big ideas. An example of this is on this first slide. So let's go through this one together, and then as you go through the rest of the poem, use this PowerPoint to help you and annotate it for yourself. Try to see where you can find examples of these 3 key big ideas. Because as we link back to that structural diagram on one of the first slides of the PowerPoint, this is something that you can refer back to in every single paragraph that you write about. So number 1, colour-coded in purple there, the power of humans. First thing we can see here is repetition. So that suggests the control the white establishment have over what the children learn and therefore what adults know. Their control over history. So it creates a sense of them and us. Using the cultural dialect, dem tell me, we've got informal pronunciation. Who is the they? The teachers, the head teachers, historians, or the government, the white establishment? So again, that links into the abuse of power. Into the red. phonetic spelling of the Caribbean accent. We've got the narrator's voice here, which links to his identity, taking control, taking the power back. And that's really important in the structure of the whole of this poem. The poem alternates between historical and fictional figures from Caribbean and British culture, and then therefore that emphasises the differences between them. The British figures, you'll notice as you heard this poem read, are skipped over quite quickly. The pace quickens, the rhythm quickens, and it's given little respect, whereas the Caribbean figures are covered in more detail. So link that then to the effects of what this has done to Agard's identity, what he's saying about the power of humans, and the effects of that conflict within his own identity. So we also need to drill down into the language. So if we have a look at the imperative verb here, this is being done to him, not with him. So he's being made subservient. They tell him. And the repetition of the tell him makes it really forceful in its tone. So as you move your way through the slides, ensure that you annotate your poem using this colour code and numbering system. Look at the metaphorical language here that's been used by Agard. Bandage up me eye with me own history. Blind me to my own identity. Really powerful metaphors that you can dig into there. Metaphors of vision and blindness. So suggesting this awareness to your identity, and actually where we get images of light later on, of beacons, it really shows positivity in his own culture, revealing his own culture. So what I've done in each slide here is I've gone through allowing you to have a look at that colour code in the 3 different sections, the big idea in the poem, and they've also provided a slide with ideas of annotations. Now, of course, with your own interpretation, push yourself further. What else can you see in your own interpretation? So I'll just highlight some of the key things here to pick up on. We've got the repetition of them tell me that we've talked about before, the metaphor here, the suggestion that it's a deliberate attempt to hide the history. The use of the bandage is ironic. It should be used to heal and not to cause blindness. As we move on to the next section, we've got the dismissal of British history with the all that. And then, of course, the use of the pantomime as history, suggesting that British history is trivial compared to Toussaint Louverture. No, dem never tell me about that. So the double negative here sounds really assertive and angry. But remember, as I'm talking this through with you, the importance of this poem is to listen to how Agard delivers it. I can't possibly do this justice, as Agard is really renowned for this performance and the fun that he gives, the power that he gives to his audience. So please do ensure that you listen to this poem over and over again and watch the video at the end. So moving on, we've got strong rhymes. Look at the physical structure of this stanza on the screen. We have broken syntax, that sentence structure, which shows this importance of the oral communication. The images of light, the beacon, contrast with that blindness of his formal education. The succession of the short lines used here slows down the pace, so that suggests that he's breaking off from his main point to recall the memory. And then as we move on, we've got the use of the nursery rhymes, an example of how British history has been taught, but again making it seem trivial. Really important figures from his own history. So talking about Nanny de Maroon here, connecting her to nature and water, this spiritual person associated with hope and liberty. Again, linked to warmth and light and to freedom, suggests that she's passionate and a figure that Agard wants to find out more about and he feels he should have been taught about. Okay, here there's a reminder that there's always more than one side to history, but we're only ever taught one, the colonist version. So in all of these figures, go back to that contextual information. Make sure you understand the importance of the figures in history that Agard is pointing out. So we have figures from British folklore and nursery rhymes that contrast with Mary Seacole, a really important real-life figure. And we've also got more metaphors used here, linking her to the wider universe. So a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. And that's a link back there to the standard English that I highlighted earlier on in one of my slides, showing the importance of this figure. She's defiant and brave. And then we've got repetition, linking us back to the opening of the poem. So the repetition from the first lines of the stanza reminds us of this narrator's point of view, potentially the anger that's coming across, possibly the frustration, but also look at the contrast and the conflict with the celebratory tone that this particular poem brings out. And look at that final line, how powerful this final line is. I carving out my identity. So the final word here sums up the main theme of the poem. He's going to use his own history to create his identity. He's taking the power back into his own hands. So think of that word carving, using words associated with battle to show how hard he's going to work to carve out his own identity. He's taking the power back into his own hands and he's going to do something about it for himself. So here on the next couple of slides, I've included a few tasks that you can use in your own revision to help you also elevate your vocabulary when you're discussing and you're giving your own interpretation of this poem. A word like oppressed. You can see there you can work through the tasks. It's an adjective. It means subject to harsh or authoritative treatment. We could look at words like colonial, again another adjective, relating to or a characteristic of a colony. And finally then, marginalised, a group of people treated as insignificant. Think about the tone that comes through this poem. This is the link that I've referenced earlier. So if you watch this YouTube clip, it's roughly about 4.5 minutes long, but it's a video that will allow you to watch Agard talk about how he wrote this poem, his intentions for this poem, and again, deliver it in his own words. And it's a really good understanding of the poet's intentions. It will help you to discuss what he's trying to show through his language, his form, and his structure. And it will also help you to discuss the conflict and the issues of power, culture, and identity, and make links to your second poem, should this poem come up in the exam, or should you use this as your second poem that you're comparing the named poem in the exam to. And finally, the last 2 slides are to challenge your knowledge. 5 questions here on both slides for you to consider and for you to test and revise the knowledge that we have just gone over. So use these recall questions, use these revision questions once you've gone through this to test your knowledge. So what is a caesura? It's important when you're digging into poetry to use technical terminology. Think about the form of a dramatic monologue, why Agard chooses to use that particular form and why he structures this in the way he does. The big ideas of this poem should be part of your discussion all the way through it. And then think about what's unique about Agard's poetry, the way that he decides to write and break the control of our normal syntax, grammar and sentence structures. The form and structure poetry normally comes in, and how you can compare that across to other poets. Okay, so that will be the end of this particular revision point. And remember to go through the poem yourself, annotate it, and think about links to other poems.